She barely moved her lips when she said it, like the words were something poisonous she didn't want the air to taste. "I'll only be a burden." The sentence came out in a whisper that belonged to the corner of a cold room, not to a person who deserved daylight. She sat on the edge of a narrow bed in the back of Mrs. Dalloway's boarding house, shoulders rounded forward, hands folded tight in her lap as if holding herself together took both of them. Her dress was clean but worn thin at the elbows, and one boot was unlaced because bending down made her wince. The other foot rested light on the floor, careful, as if pain lived there and could be woken. The lamp on the dresser smoked a little, its flame trembling in the draft that slipped under the door, and the whole room smelled of lye soap, iron, Biddy, and the faint sweetness of dried apples someone had boiled downstairs. She kept her eyes on the quilt, tracing a frayed stitch with the tip of one finger, breathing shallow, preparing to explain herself the way women learn to do when they'd been turned away too many times, slow, apologetic, already halfway gone. But the cowboy didn't let her finish. He was standing by the window, hat in his hands, not sitting because the chair looked too delicate for a man built like a fence post. He'd been quiet since he came in, quiet the way some men were when they took things serious, the kind of quiet that listened past the words to what they cost. The moment "burden" left her mouth, he crossed the room in 2 measured steps and set his hat on the dresser with care, like it mattered not to startle her. "Don't say it," he said, not loud, firm. "Be like a rule laid down to keep a child from walking into a river." She blinked, startled by the interruption more than by the tone. "I'm only being honest," she murmured, but her voice faltered, and the honesty sounded like a punishment she'd practiced. He crouched in front of her so his eyes were level with hers, boots planted, elbows on his knees, hands empty and open. Up close, she could see the dust ground into the lines at the corners of his fingers, the pale scar that cut across one knuckle, the sunburnt edge of his cheek where shaving didn't reach. He looked like a man who'd carried heavy things without complaint, but he looked at her as if she wasn't one of them. "Honest ain't always true," he said. "Sometimes it's just what folks taught you to call yourself." Her throat tightened, and she swallowed hard, and the movement small and painful. "You don't understand," she tried again, the words pushing against something in her chest that wanted to fold. "I can't." She stopped, because her knee had shifted and a sharp ache ran up her leg like a warning. The tiniest sound escaped her, more breath than cry, and she hated herself for it instantly, chin dipping as if shame could hide in shadow. His gaze flicked to her hands, to the white way she was gripping her own fingers, and something in his face hardened, not at her, but at whatever made her do that. "Tell me what hurts," he said, and it wasn't a demand. It was an offer that didn't come with a price. She shook her head. "It's not just... it's everything," she whispered. "I'm slow. She tried to finish it again, to name herself the way the town had named her since the accident, since the day she'd fallen wrong and life had shifted like a wheel breaking a spoke. But his voice cut through, gentle and unyielding. "No," he said. "You're here. That's what you are." The room felt suddenly too small for the air between them. Outside, a wagon rattled over the street stones, and someone laughed, a bright sound that didn't belong to her life. She stared at him, unsure whether to believe this was kindness or the beginning of another kind of leaving. "Why?" she asked before she could stop herself, the word raw. "Why would you want trouble?" He didn't flinch from the ugliness of it. He nodded once, slow, like he'd been waiting for her to ask the hard question instead of the safe one. "Because I heard you trying to disappear," he said, "and I don't allow it, not in a room I'm standing in." Then, as if to prove he meant it in the only language her body understood, he reached, not to take her hand, not to pull her up, but to set his palm flat on the floor beside her boot, steadying himself there, grounding the moment. "You finish that sentence," he added softly, "and it'll be a lie you're feeding the world, so don't." Before the fall, before the quiet way she learned to fold herself smaller, she had been someone who walked without counting steps, someone who laughed too loud at the wrong moments and didn't feel the need to explain it. That memory lived far enough back now that it felt borrowed, like a story told about another woman with the same face. She kept it tucked away because remembering made the present ache sharper, and she had learned that pain was easier to bear when you didn't argue with it. It had happened 2 winters ago, on a morning when the frost made the porch boards slick and she'd been hurrying because people don't wait for women who move slow. One misstep, one breath taken too fast, and the world had tilted, her foot sliding out. Her body meeting the edge of the step with a sound she still heard at night when everything else was quiet. They said it was bad luck, said she should be grateful it wasn't worse, but luck didn't help her walk afterward, and gratitude didn't soften the looks people gave when she took too long to cross a room. At first there were offers, helpful ones, they said, chairs pulled out without asking, hands grabbing her arm before she'd even decided to sit, voices raised like she couldn't hear. Each kindness came with a reminder, subtle but sharp, that she was being noticed for the wrong reason. Then came the other looks, the measuring kind, the ones that asked what she cost and whether she was worth it. Work dried up faster than the mud on her skirts. And invitations stopped altogether because people didn't know how to fit her into a world that prized speed and strength. She learned to apologize preemptively, for being late, for taking space, for the way her legs stiffened when the weather turned, because saying sorry first seemed to make it easier on everyone else. It was easier to call herself a burden than to watch someone else decide it out loud. Even the boarding house had rules written in politeness: no meals carried upstairs, no lingering in the common room where chairs were scarce, and she followed them carefully, knowing how thin patience could be. That was how she'd ended up in the back room, quiet and contained, useful only if she didn't ask for much. The cowboy hadn't seen any of that when he walked in, not the fall, not the months after when she'd woken every morning bargaining with her own body, promising to behave if it would just let her stand without pain. But he saw the result in the way she held herself now, braced for refusal, and it unsettled her more than the memory did. She wasn't used to men who looked at the aftermath instead of the inconvenience. When she shifted again, testing her knee, the familiar fire flared and she bit down on it, jaw tightening because she'd learned what happened when you let pain show. It invited opinions. "It's fine," she said automatically, the word smooth from use, though nothing about it was. She expected him to nod and step back, to accept the lie as a courtesy, but he didn't. His silence stretched, not awkward, just present, and it made her aware of the room in a way she hadn't been before, due to the fact that she was still here and not being hurried out. That was when the old fear crept in, the one that said this too would end, and that when it did, it would hurt more because she'd allowed herself to hope for something different. She lowered her gaze again, preparing herself, because hope was heavier than disappointment, and she had already decided she couldn't afford another weight to carry. Something about the way he stayed quiet made the room feel altered, as if sound itself had decided to wait and see what would happen next. He didn't rush to fill the space with reassurance or explanations, didn't reach for easy words meant to smooth things over. Instead, he remained where he was, close enough that she could sense him without having to look, steady as a post set deep in the ground. She had known men who hovered, who made their concern loud and obvious so everyone could see it, and she had known men who stepped back the moment discomfort showed its face. This was neither. It unsettled her, the patience of it, because patience implied time, and time implied she was not being measured against it. She shifted slightly, testing whether the moment would break if she moved, and when it didn't, a small, treacherous feeling stirred in her chest. He glanced toward the window, not to escape, but as if checking the world outside before deciding it could wait. "You don't have to tell me anything you don't want to," he said at last, voice low, careful not to tip the balance. "But I'm not going anywhere till you know that." The words landed without force, and that made them harder to dismiss. She drew a slow breath, aware of how shallow her breathing had become, aware, too, of the dull throb in her knee that marked each second like a clock. "People say that," she replied, a note of bitterness slipping through despite her effort, "until they see how it really is." He nodded, accepting the truth of that without defense. "Then we'll see," he answered. There was no challenge in it, only an offer to stay present for whatever followed. She studied him then, really studied him, taking in the worn creases of his coat, the way his shoulders bore their weight without strain, the faint lines around his eyes that spoke of sun and distance rather than cruelty. He didn't look at her leg when she moved. He looked at her face, as if that was where the important information lived. It was such a small thing, but it made her chest tighten unexpectedly. She had grown used to being reduced to the visible problem, to having conversations circle endlessly around what she could not do. This man seemed more interested in what she endured without saying. "It hurts more when it's cold," she heard herself admit, surprised by her own voice. The confession felt dangerous, like stepping onto thin ice, but he didn't react the way she feared. And he didn't wince or sigh or offer advice she hadn't asked for. "I figured," he said simply. "Cold finds weak places." There was no judgment in the word weak, no implication that it defined her, and that alone made something ease inside her. She swallowed, the next words pressing up despite her caution. "I try not to slow people down," she added. He let out a quiet breath, not a laugh, just a sound of understanding. "I've been slowed before," he replied. "Didn't kill me." The hint of dry humor startled her into lifting her gaze, and for a moment their eyes met, the connection brief but undeniable. She felt exposed, not because he saw her as fragile, but because he didn't seem afraid of what he saw. Outside, the noise of the town continued, indifferent and loud, but inside the room something steadier took shape. She realized then that listening, real listening, was a kind of choice, and he had made it without being asked. The realization frightened her more than indifference ever had, because it suggested a path she hadn't planned for, one where she might be allowed to exist without apology. Later, when she tried to remember exactly when the balance shifted, she would think it happened in that moment when he stood up, not abruptly, not with the scrape of boots meant to signal authority, but with the deliberate calm of a man deciding something had already been settled. He moved to the small table by the wall and nudged it aside so there was more space between the bed and the door, as if clearing a path she hadn't yet chosen to walk. The gesture was quiet, practical, and it unsettled her because it assumed she belonged in the room, not trapped in it. She watched him from beneath her lashes, the habit of caution hard to break, and felt the familiar urge rise again, the one that told her to explain herself before expectations could form. "I don't stay long anywhere," she began. Few the words lining up the way they always did when she prepared to leave before being asked. "It's easier that way. People don't have to—" She stopped, not because of pain this time, but because his head turned just enough for her to feel his attention sharpen. He didn't interrupt with his voice. He interrupted with stillness. "That's it," he said evenly. "That's the part you don't finish." She frowned, confusion cutting through her rehearsed speech. "I'm only saying what's true," she insisted, though her certainty wavered. "I take longer. I need things different. That makes me a burden." The word sat between them, heavy and practiced, and she braced herself for the usual softening that followed, the polite denial that never quite convinced. Instead, his jaw set, not in anger, but in resolve, and he shook his head once. "No," he replied, the single syllable carrying more weight than a paragraph of excuses. "That word don't belong to you." Her breath caught, surprise breaking through the numbness. "You don't get to decide that," she said before she could stop herself. The edge in her tone startled them both. He met it without flinching. "You're right," he agreed. "You don't either." Silence followed, dense and unfamiliar. She felt something unsteady stir in her chest, a mix of relief and fear, because having a belief challenged meant there was a chance it might fall apart. "People have told me," she started again, softer now, in so many ways. He leaned back against the wall, folding his arms loosely, giving her space rather than taking it. "People say a lot when it saves them effort," he answered, "doesn't make it law." The lamp flickered, the flame dipping low. And he crossed the room to adjust it, his movements unhurried, domestic in a way that felt strangely intimate. When he returned, he didn't stand over her. He sat on the edge of the chair, close enough that she could feel the warmth of him without being crowded. "You think needing something makes you less," he went on. "I think pretending you don't is what wears a person down." Her hands twisted together, knuckles aching. She wanted to argue, to defend the belief that had kept her safe by keeping her small, but the words came out wrong. "I don't want to be the reason someone regrets staying," she confessed. The admission left her raw, exposed in a way she rarely allowed. He looked at her then, really looked, and his voice dropped. "Regret comes from leaving when you shouldn't," he said. "Not from standing still long enough to carry what matters." Something in her cracked, a quiet fracture she felt rather than heard, and she realized that for the first time since the fall, someone was not asking her to move faster or be easier, but to stop trying to erase herself. The sentence she had been preparing all along lay unfinished at her feet, and for once, he would not let her pick it back up. Morning crept into the room without ceremony, a thin gray light slipping past the curtain and settling on the floorboards, like it wasn't sure it was welcome yet. She had not slept much, not because of pain, though that was there as always, but because her mind refused to stay still. Every time she closed her eyes, his voice returned, steady and unyielding, telling her the words she had carried for so long did not belong to her. She lay on her side, listening to the building wake, to footsteps overhead and the scrape of a chair downstairs, and felt the familiar urge to rise early and be out of the way before anyone noticed her. That instinct had kept her moving since the accident, leaving rooms before they grew uncomfortable, jobs before patience thinned, conversations before questions turned sharp. Leaving first meant you didn't have to watch disappointment form. When she finally sat up, easing her leg over the edge of the bed with practiced care, she found him at the small table by the window, hat off, sleeves rolled, mending a tear in his glove with deliberate concentration. The sight of it stopped her short. Men usually fixed things quickly or not at all, but he worked like time was something to be respected, not beaten. He looked up when he sensed her watching and offered a simple nod, nothing more, as if to say she could join him or not as she pleased. She lowered herself into the chair opposite him, the movement slow, deliberate, her jaw tightening when the ache flared. Habit pushed words to her tongue. "I'll go as soon as I can," she said, the apology built in, even if she hadn't used the word. "I don't want to trouble Mrs. But Dalloway," he set the glove aside and met her gaze. "You're not late," he replied, "and you're not in anyone's way." The certainty of it unsettled her more than anger would have. She stared at the tabletop, tracing a shallow scratch with her finger. "I don't stay where I'm tolerated," she admitted quietly. "It never lasts." He leaned back slightly, giving her room to speak. "Who taught you that?" The question landed gently, but it struck deep. Images rose unbidden, a foreman sighing when she couldn't keep pace, a friend's smile tightening when she declined another invitation because stairs were involved, a relative suggesting, kindly, that she consider somewhere quieter. None of them had said burden outright, but she had learned to hear it anyway. "Everyone," she answered, "or it feels that way." He considered that, then shook his head. "It sounds like you learned it because leaving kept you safe," he said. "Doesn't mean it's the only way." She let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. "If I stay," she said, voice low, "someone will have to slow down or help, and then they'll see what it costs." He rested his forearms on the table, hands loose. "Everything costs something," he said. "Question is what it gives back." The words settled between them, not demanding agreement, only thought. Outside, a wagon rolled past, the rhythm of hooves steady, unbothered by her doubts. She felt a strange pull then, a temptation to believe him, and fear followed close behind. Belief meant risk. "I don't want to be remembered as a mistake," she whispered. He didn't answer right away. When he did, his voice was quiet, certain. "You won't be," he said. Because I won't let you vanish before anyone gets the chance to know you stayed." The idea frightened her, but beneath the fear was something else, something warmer, and for the first time in a long while, she did not immediately plan her escape. By midday, the thought had settled in her chest with a familiar weight, the quiet conviction that staying would only make things harder in the end, because hope had a way of turning sharp when it broke. She sat near the window while the house emptied out, listening to doors open and close, watching shadows pass across the street below, and told herself she was only waiting for the right moment to go. Leaving had always felt like a kindness disguised as retreat, a way of sparing others the slow realization that she required more patience than they expected. Her knee throbbed steadily, the ache rising and falling like a tide, and she focused on it, because pain was simpler than uncertainty. When the cowboy returned from outside, dust on his boots and the smell of sun and leather clinging to him, she had already decided. "I should be moving on," she said, keeping her tone even, practical, as if she were discussing the weather. He paused, taking in the way she held herself stiff and resolved, and she braced for resistance or disappointment. Instead, he set his hat down and leaned against the wall, giving her his full attention without blocking her path. "Where would you go?" he asked. The question caught her off guard. "Somewhere I won't be noticed," she answered after a moment. "Somewhere it doesn't matter how long I take." He studied her face, not searching for flaws but for the truth underneath the decision. "Sounds lonely," he said. She shrugged lightly. "Lonely doesn't ask anything of you." The admission slipped out before she could soften it, and once spoken, it hung there, stark and honest. He nodded slowly. "No," he agreed. "It just takes." She shifted her weight, wincing despite herself, and felt irritation rise, not at him, but at her own body for betraying her resolve. "You don't understand," she said, the old refrain returning. "People say they don't mind helping. Then they do. I see it in their faces." He pushed away from the wall and took a step closer, stopping well short of crowding her. "I do understand," he replied. "I've been the one folks slowed for, and the one they didn't." That surprised her into looking up. He met her gaze steadily. "Leaving before you're asked feels polite," he went on. "Feels like you're sparing everyone trouble. But sometimes it's just you deciding you're not worth the inconvenience." The words stung because they echoed something she'd never dared to say aloud. "I am inconvenient," she insisted quietly. "That's not the same thing," he countered. Silence settled between them, thick with everything she was afraid to admit. She thought of the road stretching out ahead, of rooms where no one learned her name, of starting over again and again until even she forgot who she had been. The idea brought a strange calm, the comfort of the familiar. "If I stay," she said at last, "and you change your mind." She didn't finish, but he understood. "Then I'll tell you," he said simply. "And you'll leave knowing the truth, not guessing at it." The fairness of that nearly undid her. She swallowed, fighting the tightness in her throat. Staying no longer felt brave, it felt exposed. Leaving would be easier, kinder. And yet, as she looked at him standing there without impatience or pity, she realized that choosing to go now would mean carrying the same sentence with her to the next place, unfinished and unchallenged. Her decision wavered, balanced on the edge between safety and something she didn't yet know how to name. Evening drew its line across the room slowly, the light turning amber as the sun dipped behind the rooftops, and with it came a quiet she wasn't used to sharing. She stood by the window longer than necessary, watching the street empty, feeling the decision press against her ribs with every breath. Staying meant being seen not just once, but again tomorrow, and the day after that, until familiarity replaced novelty and patience was tested by routine. She told herself she was thinking it through carefully, but fear had a way of dressing itself up as reason. When she finally turned back, he was where she had left him, seated at the table, attention on a simple meal laid out without ceremony, as if he had assumed she would still be there to share it. The assumption unsettled her more than doubt ever had. "You don't have to plan around me," she said, the words coming sharper than she intended. He glanced up, surprised but not offended. "I wasn't," he answered. "I was planning to eat." The simplicity of it caught her off guard, and a humorless breath escaped her. She lowered herself into the chair opposite him, the familiar flare of pain drawing her focus inward for a moment until it eased. "If I stay," she said carefully, "things will change. Not today, maybe not tomorrow, but eventually." He set his fork down, giving her his full attention. "Everything changes," he replied. "Staying just means you're here to see how." She studied his face, looking for the impatience she expected to find hidden somewhere, the subtle tightening that betrayed a man already calculating cost. Instead, she found resolve, quiet and unadorned. "What if I slow you down?" she asked, the question stripped bare at last. He considered it without dismissing it. "Then I slow down," he said. The answer was so immediate it left no room for argument. She felt something loosen inside her, something she had kept clenched for so long she hadn't noticed the strain. "You shouldn't have to," she insisted weakly. He shook his head. "I shouldn't have to hurry past things that matter," he said. The words settled into her chest with unexpected warmth. She pushed her plate away, appetite gone, hands resting in her lap as she weighed the choice in front of her. Leaving would be clean, decisive, a return to the rules she understood. Staying would be uncertain, messy, and it would require trust she wasn't sure she possessed. Outside, a breeze stirred dust along the street, and she imagined herself walking into it alone, carrying the same explanation to the next place, the same practiced apology. The thought felt suddenly hollow. "If I stay," she said slowly, "I won't promise to be easy." He nodded once. "I wasn't asking for easy." Silence followed, not awkward, just full. She realized then that no one was urging her either way, that the decision was finally hers to make without being shaped by someone else's discomfort. The realization was frightening, but it was also steadying. She drew a deep breath, deeper than she had in days, and let it out carefully. "All right," she said, the word quiet but firm. "I'll stay. For now." He didn't smile or reach for her hand. He simply inclined his head, accepting the choice for what it was, a beginning rather than a promise. As the light faded and the room settled around them, she felt the sentence she had carried for so long lose its hold, unfinished not because it was forbidden, but because she no longer believed it needed to be said. The first test did not come loudly or all at once, but in small pressures that built the way storms did when no one was watching the horizon. It started the next morning when she stepped out onto the porch and felt the eyes, before she heard the voices, the familiar pause in conversation that told her she had been noticed for the wrong reason. She kept her chin level and moved carefully, every motion measured, aware of the stiffness in her knee and the way it changed her pace. Staying meant this, she realized, not the quiet safety of a closed room, but the open space where judgment lived. From across the street, a man she recognized from the feed store shook his head, not cruelly, just dismissive, and said something under his breath to the woman beside him. The woman glanced at her leg, then away, as if the sight itself were inconvenient. Her old instinct flared, sharp and immediate, urging her to retreat before the weight of it settled. She shifted her balance, preparing to turn back inside, when the cowboy stepped out behind her without a word. He didn't touch her. He didn't hurry her. He simply stood there, close enough that his presence altered the shape of the moment. "Morning," he called evenly to no one in particular, his voice carrying just far enough to be heard. The word cut through the murmurs, and a few heads turned fully now, forced to acknowledge them both. She felt the familiar tightening in her chest, the certainty that this was the point where patience thinned and tolerance ended. Instead, nothing happened. The man by the feed store looked away first. The woman followed. The street resumed its rhythm, slower now, cautious. She let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. "You didn't have to do that," she murmured, embarrassment creeping in alongside relief. He glanced down at her, expression unreadable. "I didn't," he replied. "I wanted to." They walked together then, not arm in arm, not close enough to invite comment, but side by side in a way that made their shared pace unmistakable. Each step sent a dull reminder through her leg, and she focused on keeping her stride steady, refusing to shrink herself smaller. Halfway down the block, a boy darted past them, careless and fast, nearly colliding with her. She stumbled, the world tilting dangerously, and for a split second, the old panic surged, the certainty that this was where she fell again and proved everyone right. The cowboy's hand came out instinctively, not gripping, just bracing her elbow long enough for her to find her balance. The contact was brief, respectful, and it steadied more than her body. "Careful," he said to the boy, tone firm but not unkind. The boy muttered an apology and ran on. She stood there a moment longer, heart pounding, waiting for the familiar rush of shame. It didn't come. Instead, there was only the awareness that she was still standing, that someone had seen the risk and met it without making it a spectacle. "I hate that," she admitted quietly. "Needing that." He considered her words as they resumed walking. "Needing help ain't the same as being helpless," he said. "World likes to pretend it is." The truth of it settled slowly, reshaping something inside her. By the time they reached the end of the street, she realized the test had already passed. Not because the world had changed, but because she hadn't been left alone to face it. For the first time since choosing to stay, she understood that protection did not mean being hidden away from hardship. It meant having someone stand beside you when hardship decided to show itself. In the days that followed, she noticed how easily worth was measured in the town, weighed out in speed and strength, and what a person could lift without complaint. It was in the way work was offered and withdrawn, in the glances exchanged when someone faltered, in the unspoken rule that usefulness was the closest thing to belonging. She felt that pressure keenly, now that she had chosen to stay, the old urge to prove herself stirring every time she moved too slowly or paused to ease the ache in her knee. One afternoon, while she was sorting beans at the kitchen table, she pushed herself past what was sensible, fingers stiffening as pain crept upward, because stopping felt like admitting failure. The cowboy watched from the doorway for a moment before stepping in. "That's enough," he said quietly. She bristled at once, pride flaring. I can finish," she replied, jaw set. "I should." He crossed the room and gently took the bowl from her hands, setting it aside without spilling a single bean. "I didn't say you couldn't," he answered. "I said you don't have to." The distinction caught her off guard. "If I don't pull my weight," she insisted, "then what am I doing here?" He met her gaze steadily. "You're living," he said. "That's not a debt." The words unsettled her more than correction ever had. She leaned back in the chair, breath unsteady, the familiar argument rising in her chest that usefulness was the only protection she had ever known. "People don't keep what doesn't earn its place," she said softly. He shook his head. "People keep what they choose," he replied. "Earning just makes it easier to walk away." The truth of it stung because it rang too close to her own experience. She had spent years making herself easy to lose, light enough to be set down without regret. That evening, when the ache in her leg flared hard enough to force her stillness, she waited for frustration to show on his face. It didn't. He adjusted his pace without comment, moved tasks within her reach, filled the quiet with ordinary conversation that did not circle endlessly around what she lacked. The absence of judgment felt strange, almost suspicious, and she found herself testing it without meaning to. "You don't need me here," she said at one point, the sentence half-formed, familiar. He looked at her then, expression serious. "I didn't say need," he corrected. "I said want." The word landed with unexpected force. Want implied choice without obligation, presence without purpose attached. It frightened her because it left no place to hide behind effort or usefulness. Later, when she lay awake listening to the sounds of the house settle around her, she realized how deeply she had tied her value to what she could offer without complaint. Letting go of that felt like stepping onto open ground without knowing where shelter lay. The next morning, when she reached for a task out of habit and found it already done, she started to apologize, the word rising automatically. He glanced up and shook his head before she could speak. "You don't owe me busy," he said. The simplicity of it cracked something open inside her, and she felt tears sting unexpectedly, not from pain but from the relief of being allowed to exist without justification. In that moment, she understood that staying was teaching her something far harder than leaving ever had, that she was being asked not to prove her worth, but to accept it, and that acceptance carried a weight all its own. Peace did not arrive with celebration or certainty. It came quietly, the way morning settles over land that has known too many storms to trust sudden brightness. She noticed it first in small things, in how she no longer flinched at footsteps in the hall, in how her breath came easier when she stood, in how the word burden had begun to feel foreign, like a language she no longer spoke fluently. The town had not transformed overnight. People still glanced, still measured, still made their quiet calculations. But something essential had shifted in how she met their eyes. She did not hurry now to explain herself, did not rush to soften her presence before it could offend. One afternoon, as she moved carefully along the porch rail, her knee aching but steady, a woman from 2 houses down paused and offered a greeting that was neither kind nor cruel, just ordinary. The normalcy of it surprised her more than open rejection ever had. Inside, the cowboy was repairing a hinge, movements unhurried, absorbed. She watched him for a moment, realizing that he no longer felt like a guard against the world, but a companion within it. "I was thinking," she said, voice tentative but not apologetic. He glanced up. "That can be dangerous," he replied dryly, and the hint of humor eased something tight in her chest. "I don't want to stay because you're protecting me," she continued. "I want to stay because this feels real." He straightened slowly, considering her words with the same care he gave everything else. "Protection's meant to end," he said. Chow, what comes after, is choice. The simplicity of it struck her deeply. Choice meant she could leave without running, stay without hiding, exist without negotiation. That evening, when the light faded and the house grew still, she found herself sitting at the table without the familiar urge to account for her presence. The ache in her leg was there, constant as ever, but it no longer defined the limits of her worth. "I used to think I was something people had to carry," she said quietly, surprising herself with the confession. He set aside what he was doing and listened. "Turns out I was just someone who needed a place to stand." He nodded once, as if this aligned with something he had known all along. "Standing don't require permission," he said. Later, as night settled fully, she lay awake listening to the steady sounds of the house and felt no need to plan her escape. The sentence she had once whispered no longer waited at the edge of her thoughts, unfinished and heavy. It had lost its power because it no longer described her. She was not a burden to be managed or a problem to be solved. She was a presence, imperfect, slower than most, marked by pain and persistence both, and that presence mattered simply because it was there. Outside, the world continued in all its indifference and challenge, but inside, something durable had taken root. Not rescue, not dependence, but belonging earned not through usefulness or silence, but through the simple, radical act of staying. If this story moved you, like the video, share it with someone who believes mercy still matters, and subscribe to Redemption West for more quiet Western stories of redemption. Do you think she was right to stay, or would you have walked away before being seen?